Ladies and gentlemen, continuing with the Capitalism series. We have here Stuart H. Holbrook in The Age of the Mogul, I don't know how to say it. Someone's corrected me before and I don't recall. I believe it's a term from India, is that true? So we're in part 4 of the book, New Giants Appear. We're just going to start off because this is my favorite biography, I think, of the 1800s, and I may discover a more favorite one, but I don't think so. So we're going to look at James Jerome Hill, J.J. Hill, a railroad tycoon in the later 1800s. We're on chapter 2, page 190. James Jerome Hill, of his abilities, an expert on railroad strategy, wrote, quote, "Mr. Hill's judgment has never been seriously at fault in any of his undertakings," end quote. Jim Hill has been called the Commodore Vanderbilt of the West. The analogy is not sound. Hill was an original. In his lifetime he was called many things. The empire builder, the man who made the Northwest, the man who wrecked the Northwest, the scourge of Minnesota and the Dakotas, the curse of Montana, the Puget Sound pirate, the Oregon bandit. He was the true prophet of northern wheat. He was the evil one of homesteaders, who named a particularly offensive weed Jim Hill mustard. This was him, Jim Hill, the barbed-wired, shaggy-head, one-eyed old so-and-so of the Great West. It's true he only had one eye. Well, one of his eyes got put out in a bad accident when he was a kid, and they put it back in, but they weren't able to fix it up. So he was blind in that eye. Although apparently you wouldn't know it if you looked at him, according to a documentary which is in my favorites if you care to watch it. 45 minutes long or half an hour, something fantastic documentary there. Jim Hill began life with nothing. He came to be lord of an empire that reached from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound, from the Canadian border to Missouri and Colorado, and staked out provinces in China and Japan. He died with $53 million. This was only half as much as Commodore Vanderbilt left behind, but Hill won it in a region sparsely settled and believed by most Eastern capitalists to be an intact and worthless wilderness. A lot of things were said of the Northeast. You couldn't build a railroad through there, of course. There were 3 transcontinental railroads built, and they chose the 3 best and easiest sites, and that's why the Northwest still had no railroad. He was born in Ontario, Canada in 1838. At 18, he was on his own in the raw new settlement of Pig's Eye, later Christian St. Paul on the upper Mississippi. It was to be his base of operation for 60 years. After clerking for a river steamboat line, he set up for himself as a forward agent. About 1866, he contracted to supply fuel for the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, Minnesota's chief source of revenue for corruptionists, lobbyists, and legislators. Hill also ranged out to see what Minnesota contained in the way of opportunity for an energetic young man. The Red River of North Dakota looked good. It flowed northward into Manitoba, and its traffic was cared for by a monopoly of the hoary old Hudson's Bay Company. Hill observed, correctly enough, that the United States and the Dominion of Canada were free countries, then put a boat of his own on the Red. He added another and called himself the Red River Transportation Company. In a little while, he had won a large portion of the river trade. While running his river line, he could also watch the steady decay of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. If he could but lay hands on that streak of rust and corruption, he told his good friend Norman Kitson, agent for the Hudson's Bay Company, it could be turned into a profitable enterprise. Along came the panic of 1873 to add the final touch needed. The railroad went into receivership. Hill felt the time had come to act. Now, I mentioned this again and again in early parts of this Capitalism series. A recession is simply that period in which resources get reallocated to more efficient people. That's all a recession is. They shouldn't last long, and they should revitalize the economy with new ideas, new growth, new capital. Hill had a little money, so did Kitson. To buy the St. Paul and Pacific, however, would call for several $1 million. Hill and Kitson went to Canada for the capital. acting through Donald Smith, one of the Bay Company's big men, and George Stephen, head of the Bank of Montreal, $6 million was raised. Hill and Kitson added $780,000 from their own resources. The four men then organized the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad and took over the bankrupt line. Now it mentions that in order to get this so cheaply, Hill himself took the bondholders committee, the committee of people who hold the bonds of the company, took them over the line and showed them the worst parts. Supposedly he showed them the worst parts. Maybe he showed them the whole line and just told them how bad a shape it was in. But legend has it, it says here, or tradition has it, that he showed them over the most worthless stretches of it, and in the most decrepit rolling stock available. He took them in the worst rolling stock he had. And he said, "Behold your folly, look at this nonsense." At $6,780,000, it was something of a bargain. The new owners promptly sold the greater part of its land for $13 million. They still owned the railroad, such as it was. Well, I mean, that's brilliant, isn't it? There's this committee of people who have no frickin' clue what they're going to do with this decrepit railroad, and they say, "I'm out for $6 million? Give us $6 million. We'll take our $6 million and run." They feel good about their $6 million. Now this more intelligent man has control of the resources, and they immediately raise $13 million off, paying off their original, redistributing the land to people who can use it. And now, what are they going to do with their $13 million? We'll skip down just a bit. Directing the job in person, Hill drove his construction crews at a furious rate. Across Minnesota went the rails, then north to the border to meet the Canadian Pacific, which have built a line south from Winnipeg. Two great harvests followed completion of the first Hill Railroad, and the freight traffic grew heavy and profitable. What had been a trickle of immigrants from Norway and Sweden turned to a flood, for Hill's agents had been in Scandinavia singing the glories of the Red River Valley. Homesteads could be had for free, or Jim Hill would sell some of the land grant still in his possession for $2.50 an acre. The lands along the way filled up rapidly. Jim Hill's idea of a railroad was not a piece of track to connect the Twin Cities with Winnipeg. As early as 1879, he told his fellow directors, he meant to push the road across the continent to reach Puget Sound. Some of the directors were agitated. No other concern had attempted to build a transcontinental without subsidy from the government. This is my favorite part. This is why I love the guy. Didn't take subsidies, wouldn't take subsidies, and his railroad's the only one that never went bankrupt. But, not to skip to the end of the story. The Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the Northern Pacific each had been given millions of public acres. Hill could get no land grant, other than that the road already had in Minnesota and had largely sold. Did Hill not realize that to reach Puget Sound he must cross the savage voids of Dakota and Montana and Idaho before he even got to Washington? And that Washington alone presented another 400 miles and another rugged range of mountains before Tidewater could be reached? Didn't he know? That was the last outpost of Native American Indians. Now, that was going to be the last stand of the war against the Indians, was going to be in the north. The army just chased them and chased them and chased them and put them in smaller and smaller corners of land, but eventually we just had to slaughter them in a very bloody battle, wounded knee or something, battle at Wounded Knee. Because they just kept attacking white people. They attacked pilgrims and immigrants and stuff. They would raid settlements once in a while. And this area up here, he proposes to build a railroad through. Did he not realize that even if by some sort of legerdemain he did manage to lay his rails to Puget Sound, he could not hope to compete with the Northern Pacific, subsidized with an immense federal and land grant? So even if you do get your railroad over there, there's the federal Northern Pacific, they're subsidized. You can't touch them. Jim Hill knew all this. He was still determined. His presumptuous plan, when it became public, was quickly labeled Hill's Folly. Now recall that quote earlier, Hill's never been incorrect on any of his undertakings. Hill's Folly moved westward with great speed, though not so fast as to preclude short feeder lines being built. As the main rails moved on,